The Sterling Tower stood as a monument of modern engineering, its glass and steel facade reflecting a cold, unforgiving morning sky above the silent city. Inside the secure presentation suite, CEO Eleanor Sterling maintained absolute composure as military officials prepared to review the company's billion-dollar defense grid. Far below the polished floors, in the humming server matrix, Julian Pierce quietly inspected a rack of network cables, completely ignored by the world above. The massive digital display in the boardroom illuminated the faces of the executives, tracking simulated external threats against the company's supposedly impenetrable digital walls. Suddenly, the pristine blue interface fractured into chaotic red warning cascades, signaling an unprecedented systemic failure right in front of the silent delegates. Eleanor's expression remained perfectly still, masking a sudden chill of dread, while her uncle Marcus watched the collapsing data with a deeply calculated silence. Deep underground, a subtle shift in the pitch of the server cooling fans caught Julian's attention, prompting him to slowly set down his heavy toolkit. Without a word, he moved smoothly through the shadows of the basement toward a forgotten, offline auxiliary terminal covered in years of accumulated dust. His calloused hands moved over the archaic keyboard with lethal precision, executing 4 lines of deep-level override logic known to almost no one. In the boardroom, the red alarms instantly vanished into stable green, leaving Eleanor staring intently at the screen, analyzing the unknown origin of the rescue. A wave of collective exhalation swept through the boardroom as the military delegates settled back into their leather chairs, the immediate threat of a catastrophic digital breach seemingly neutralized. While others celebrated the narrow escape, Marcus Sterling remained rigid, his silver pen tapping a slow, methodical rhythm against the dark oak table as his mind calculated the interference. Masking her inner turmoil, Eleanor turned sharply to the chief engineer, demanding an immediate trace of the undocumented command protocol that had just saved their billion-dollar contract. The main display shifted, revealing a jagged digital pathway that inexplicably terminated at an abandoned sub-level network node, a location supposedly decommissioned years ago. Far removed from the executive tension, Julian quietly detached the mechanical keyboard, severing the physical connection to the mainframe before anyone could pinpoint the exact origin. With fluid, practiced motions, he draped a heavy canvas tarp back over the archaic terminal, effectively erasing any immediate evidence of his digital intervention in the shadows. Lifting his heavy toolkit, he merged back into the dimly lit corridor, transforming instantly back into an invisible maintenance worker beneath the notice of the corporate elite. Back on the top floor, Marcus leaned closely into Eleanor's personal space, whispering a chilling directive to lock down the building and find the unauthorized architect. Projecting absolute authority, Eleanor smoothly concluded the presentation, offering the delegates a flawless diplomatic smile that successfully concealed the internal fractures of the Sterling Empire. The moment the heavy oak doors closed behind the last guest, her smile vanished completely, replaced by a cold, calculating stare directed at the now empty digital interface. The lockdown protocols activated immediately, sealing the heavy glass doors of Sterling Tower and trapping the night shift personnel inside the massive structure. Marcus directed the internal security team with ruthless precision, ordering a floor-by-floor sweep to root out the source of the unauthorized digital intervention. Down in the maintenance bay, Julian stood quietly by his tool cart, sorting a handful of zip ties with practiced, unhurried movements. The security detail flooded the basement, led by Marcus, whose sharp eyes scanned the faces of the silent, working-class technicians. Eleanor watched from the glass mezzanine overhead, her posture stiff and unyielding, observing her uncle's aggressive tactics with mounting, silent suspicion. Marcus halted abruptly next to Julian's workstation, his gaze fixing on a restricted red-taped USB drive resting suspiciously on the top tray of the cart. The atmosphere in the basement grew suffocating as Marcus held the restricted drive up, loudly demanding to know how it ended up in a maintenance zone. Julian stepped forward with absolute calm, his expression devoid of panic, maintaining a respectful distance while looking directly into Marcus's calculating eyes. Under strict orders, Julian methodically emptied his pockets and rolled up his coverall sleeves, revealing nothing but a folded receipt and an old pencil. With a steady, pilot-like cadence, Julian quietly informed Marcus that the basement security cameras would confirm the drive was placed there 15 minutes before his shift began. Defeated by the undeniable logic of the security timestamps, Marcus abruptly turned and ordered the lockdown lifted, his face dark with suppressed frustration. Eleanor watched her uncle retreat, the seeds of doubt firmly planted in her mind as she realized the true threat was likely inside her own family. Later that evening, the Sterling Tower emptied out, leaving only a young data analyst named Ethan staring intensely at his glowing monitors in the silent IT department. Running a deep diagnostic on the system crash, Ethan stumbled upon a terrifying anomaly buried deep within the network's failover architecture. Line 742 of the core defense code had been deliberately altered, delaying the backup protocol just long enough to ensure a complete systemic collapse. A shadow fell over Ethan's desk. Julian Pierce stood quietly behind him, holding a steaming cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on the exact line of corrupted code. Without asking, Julian pointed directly at the screen, calmly explaining that the modification was not a glitch, but a perfectly engineered internal disruption. Ethan looked up at the maintenance worker in sheer disbelief, realizing that whoever wrote this code wanted the corporation to fall while hiding behind a synthetic error. Julian did not offer any comfort. He simply set the coffee down on the desk, his expression hardening with the weight of a long-buried truth. Leaving the young analyst to process the revelation, Julian walked away down the dark corridor, moving one step closer to unmasking the ghost from his past. Far from the towering glass of the corporate district, Julian returned to a quiet, dimly lit suburban home where the air felt entirely different. In the small living room, his 8-year-old son, Leo, sat cross-legged on the floor, deeply focused on drawing a complex structural diagram with colored pencils. Julian leaned against the doorframe, watching his son with a profound, quiet tenderness that stripped away his cold, calculated exterior. Stepping closer, Julian noticed the drawing was a detailed digital fortress with a heavy wall, but Leo had deliberately drawn a hidden door at the back. When asked about the hidden door, the boy calmly explained that every strong wall needed a secret way for the protector to get inside when things went wrong. Julian knelt beside his son, his eyes softening as he recognized the echo of his own architectural mind in the boy's innocent logic. He pulled Leo into a gentle embrace, silently reaffirming the deeply personal reason he had chosen a life of shadows over corporate glory. Meanwhile, back in the penthouse office of Sterling Tower, Eleanor sat alone in the dark, staring intensely at a blank wall. Driven by a relentless instinct, she opened her private laptop and initiated a heavily encrypted background search on the maintenance worker named Julian Pierce. The system processed the query for a long moment before flashing a stark, bright red warning across her screen: identity classified, access denied. The glaring red rejection notice cast a harsh light across Eleanor's face, confirming that the humble maintenance worker possessed a clearance level higher than the CEO herself. Slowly, she closed the laptop, the penthouse office plunging back into darkness as she processed the reality of a high-level phantom operating within her walls. The following morning, daylight flooded the grand marble lobby of Sterling Tower, where Julian Pierce stood seamlessly blending into the background, carrying a heavy aluminum ladder. Eleanor crossed the lobby with her executive entourage, her eyes briefly locking with Julian's in a silent, calculating exchange before she continued toward the elevators. High above the lobby, Marcus paced nervously in his luxurious corner office, his polished exterior cracking under the pressure of the failing timeline. Retrieving a cheap prepaid phone from a locked drawer, Marcus dialed an offshore number, quietly arranging the untraceable movement of corporate funds. Deep in the forgotten sub-basement, far from the security cameras, Julian approached a rusted electrical junction box bolted to a damp concrete wall. Using a specialized set of micro-tools, he carefully spliced a hair-thin optical cable directly into the building's physical fiber-optic nervous system. A small, unmarked data drive in his palm blinked to life, quietly siphoning the encrypted financial logs that Marcus believed were permanently hidden. Disconnecting the drive, Julian slipped it securely into his pocket and closed the rusted panel, his face set with the cold determination of a hunter closing in. Eleanor stepped off a creaking freight elevator into the dusty, dimly lit paper archives of Sterling Dynamics, a place untouched by modern digital firewalls. She navigated through endless rows of towering metal shelves, searching desperately for physical records that predated her uncle's aggressive restructuring. Pulling a heavy, dust-covered binder labeled Project Alpha 2 from the bottom shelf, she opened it under the weak light of a viewing table. Inside, she found an old photograph of her late father standing proudly next to a much younger, sharply dressed Julian Pierce. A soft footstep echoed through the silent room, causing Eleanor to turn sharply and find Julian standing quietly at the end of the shadowy aisle. Still wearing his stained maintenance uniform, Julian looked at the open binder, calmly noting that physical paper was the only thing Marcus could not easily erase. Eleanor demanded to know why the brilliant lead architect of her father's greatest legacy was now quietly emptying trash cans in the basement. Julian's voice dropped to a chilling, steady whisper as he explained that his wife had discovered a manufactured system vulnerability just days before her fatal accident. He stepped out of the shadows, his piercing gaze locking onto Eleanor, stating that he returned to unmask the person who orchestrated his wife's permanent silence. Leaving the heavy, undeniable truth hanging in the dusty air, Julian turned and disappeared back into the darkness, leaving Eleanor entirely shaken. Eleanor stood by her massive office window, staring out at the city, the weight of her father's legacy and her uncle's betrayal settling heavily on her shoulders. Moving decisively to her desk, she placed a secure, untraceable call to Ethan, the young data analyst who had first discovered the corrupted code. Ethan arrived nervously at the penthouse a few minutes later, clutching his encrypted laptop and glancing over his shoulder to ensure he wasn't followed. Eleanor bypassed pleasantries, instructing him to ignore standard firewalls and immediately pull the physical badge swipe logs from the night the system was quietly sabotaged. Ethan's fingers flew across the keyboard, his face illuminated by the stark white light of raw, unfiltered security data streaming across his screen. He stopped abruptly, pointing a trembling finger at a single entry. Marcus Sterling was the only executive inside the server level at exactly 2:14 a.m. Meanwhile, in the main executive boardroom, Marcus aggressively commanded his loyalists, pushing to fast-track the defense contract before any official audit could occur. He slammed his silver pen down on the oak table, demanding total silence and absolute compliance from the visibly nervous board members. Back in the penthouse, Ethan carefully handed Eleanor a small silver flash drive containing the undeniable digital proof of her uncle's internal treason. Eleanor slowly slipped the drive into her pocket and slid on her tailored suit jacket, her eyes hardening into icy resolve as she prepared for corporate war. Eleanor rode the elevator down to the lowest level, the glowing digital numbers reflecting in her eyes as she descended into Julian's hidden territory. The heavy metal doors parted, revealing the gritty maintenance bay where Julian Pierce was quietly packing away his heavy tools for the final time. Stepping into the harsh fluorescent light, Eleanor held up the small silver flash drive, an unspoken confirmation that she now knew the entire truth. She didn't offer a long corporate explanation, she simply looked at him and stated that she could not face the corrupted board alone. Julian paused, his rough hands resting on the metal cart, understanding that his 7-year wait in the shadows had finally come to an end. Without a single word, he reached for the heavy brass collar zipper of his stained navy coveralls and pulled it decisively downward. Shedding the rough canvas exterior, he revealed a sharply tailored white dress shirt and a dark tie, looking every bit the brilliant architect he truly was. The physical transformation was absolute, the invisible mechanic disappeared, replaced by a formidable, commanding presence ready to dismantle Marcus's empire. 40 floors above, Marcus called the emergency meeting to order, projecting an aura of complete control to the anxious room of executives. Smiling a cold, victorious smile, Marcus prepared to push the contract through, completely unaware of the perfect storm rising silently up the elevator shaft. In the high-stakes boardroom, Marcus laid out his meticulously crafted narrative, aggressively blaming an offshore subcontractor for the systemic failure. He raised his silver pen to formalize the new security protocols, effectively burying his own treason under layers of corporate bureaucracy. Without warning, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open, shattering the tense silence of the executive committee. Eleanor stepped into the room, her posture radiating an absolute, unyielding authority that immediately unsettled her previously overconfident uncle. Before Marcus could reprimand her, a second figure stepped through the doors, causing the breath to catch visibly in the older man's throat. Julian Pierce, stripped of his maintenance disguise and wearing a sharp suit, walked in with the terrifying, silent calm of an apex predator. Recovering his shock, Marcus angrily stood up, loudly demanding that security remove the unauthorized mechanic from the highly classified executive briefing. Eleanor simply raised a single hand, silencing her uncle instantly as she formally reintroduced Julian as the original chief architect of the defense network. Ignoring Marcus completely, Julian walked directly past the stunned executives to the main presentation console and slid the silver flash drive into the terminal. The massive screen behind Marcus instantly shifted from corporate logos to the stark, undeniable red text of the corrupted Line 742. The boardroom was bathed in the harsh, pulsating red glow of the exposed code, silence broken only by the frantic tapping of Julian's keyboard. With surgical precision, Julian navigated to a hidden directory, revealing a multi-year trail of untraceable wire transfers linking Marcus to an overseas shell corporation. The figures flashed across the screen in brutal detail, exposing how funds intended for defense R&D had been siphoned into Marcus's private offshore accounts. Marcus staggered back against the mahogany desk, his face draining of all color as the weight of his systematic betrayal became public record. The Lockheed representatives at the table exchanged sharp, predatory glances, realizing the contract they were about to sign was built on a foundation of sabotage. Marcus desperately stammered that his accounting department had been compromised, attempting to cast blame on unnamed subordinates to preserve his own reputation. Eleanor didn't move, her cold gaze piercing through his frantic excuses, her hand resting firmly on the back of the chair beside her as an anchor. Julian stepped closer to Marcus, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the room's absolute, terrified attention. He laid out the timeline of the wire transfers, cross-referencing them perfectly with the dates of the system crashes that had cost lives in the field. The gravity of the crimes forced the room into a state of total paralysis. Marcus realized that the man he had once deemed a simple mechanic was now his executioner. The board members sat in stunned silence as the red interface confirmed every illicit transfer, turning the room into a theater of collective betrayal. Marcus reached into his pocket with shaking hands, desperate to press the remote trigger that would wipe the evidence from the company's primary server. Julian watched the movement with cold, predatory anticipation, his fingers already hovering over the override console to intercept the signal. As Marcus clicked the remote, Julian slammed his hand down, creating an impenetrable digital firewall that rendered the deletion request completely inert. A chilling silence permeated the boardroom, interrupted only by the distant, rhythmic wail of sirens echoing up from the city streets below. Eleanor stood motionless, her eyes locked on her uncle, witnessing the final collapse of the mask he had worn for nearly 2 decades. Marcus turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down in terror as blue and red emergency lights began to surround the base of Sterling Tower. The heavy boardroom doors clicked open once more, this time admitting 2 federal agents in dark, professional attire who moved with synchronized purpose. Marcus slumped into his leather chair, the remaining strength drained from his body as he realized his attempt to escape had only solidified his fate. Julian stepped back from the console, his work as the silent architect complete, leaving the boardroom to the quiet judgment of the law. Marcus stood trembling, his finger pointing wildly at the technical staff in the corner, accusing them of a grand conspiracy to hijack his vision for the company. The room remained cold, the only response being the steady, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the hard, unblinking stares of the executive board. Marcus frantically gestured toward the contract drafts, imploring the board to ignore the glitched data and proceed with the multi-billion-dollar signing. Eleanor remained perfectly still, her face a mask of iron, as she watched her uncle dismantle his own credibility with every frantic word he uttered. One of the Lockheed representatives stood up, his expression devoid of empathy, and requested that the board immediately authorize a full forensic data lockdown. The room tightened as the motion was seconded by the chairman, signaling the formal end of Marcus's reign over the Sterling Dynamics defense contract. Marcus felt the floor beneath him shift, his grip on the mahogany table slipping as the realization hit that his allies were distancing themselves. Julian stood near the console, his presence a silent pillar of truth that anchored the room, his eyes never leaving Marcus's desperate, shifting movements. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, ordering the staff to secure the primary server room under immediate federal protocol. As the staff moved to execute her command, Marcus sank into his chair, a defeated man watching the walls of his empire close in around him. The boardroom, once a temple of corporate order, fractured into whispers and panicked side conversations as the board members turned their backs on Marcus. A senior board member, a man who had known Marcus for decades, slowly stood up and walked to the other side of the table, distancing himself from the disgraced executive. Seeing his power base disintegrate in real time, Marcus lashed out, throwing a glass of water against the wall in a desperate, childish display of defiance. Eleanor did not blink, her icy gaze remaining fixed on the documents, her silence proving far more dangerous than any outburst her uncle could muster. Julian watched the scene with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a chemical reaction, his hand resting calmly on the presentation console. The head of corporate security entered the room, his eyes scanning the evidence on the screen before shifting to Marcus, his loyalty visibly wavering. Seeing the security chief's hesitation, Marcus barked a frantic order to have Julian forcibly removed, but his voice lacked any semblance of true authority. The security chief looked at Eleanor, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod, signaling that the time for blind allegiance to the old guard was officially over. Two guards stepped forward, not toward Julian, but toward Marcus, their movements slow and heavy with the gravity of the shift in power. Marcus recoiled, stumbling backward into his chair as the realization finally struck him, he was no longer the architect of this empire, but its first prisoner. Federal agents moved through the boardroom with clinical efficiency, systematically documenting the digital wreckage Marcus had left behind in his wake. The atmosphere in the room shifted from chaotic panic to a cold, sterile environment as legal teams began cataloging the evidence for the incoming investigation. Marcus sat slumped in his chair, eyes vacant, watching as his personal executive terminal was unplugged and placed into an evidence bag by the agents. Eleanor stood at the head of the long oak table, her voice ringing out clearly as she demanded a comprehensive audit of every subsidiary contract signed under Marcus's tenure. The chairman, recovering his composure, gave a silent nod of agreement, effectively stripping Marcus of his final remaining influence within the corporation. Julian retreated toward the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh hallway lights, a shadow finally stepping out of the industrial basement to observe the result of his work. Before he exited, he paused to press a small, encrypted keycard into Eleanor's hand, a silent gesture of solidarity that confirmed their new, shared mission. Eleanor looked down at the keycard, then back at Julian, a brief, sharp nod acknowledging that the hardest part of the corporate purge was only just beginning. The agents escorted Marcus out of the boardroom, his footsteps shuffling unevenly on the polished floors, a stark contrast to the confident gait he had held that morning. With the primary antagonist removed, the room fell into a heavy, thoughtful silence, the board members left to reconcile with the sheer scale of the deception they had facilitated. Behind the glass walls of a secure holding room, Marcus paced like a cornered animal, his fingers dialing a private number to his last remaining ally in the board. His voice was a frantic, desperate whisper, pleading for an emergency intervention to stop the audit before the offshore logs could be decrypted. Eleanor stood outside the holding room, her silhouette cold and unmoving, watching her uncle destroy the last vestiges of his reputation. Inside the primary server room, technicians moved with clinical caution, pulling hard drives from the racks under the watchful gaze of two federal agents. Every drive was logged, labeled, and sealed in anti-static evidence bags, effectively erasing Marcus's ability to manipulate the digital narrative from afar. Julian leaned against the sterile hallway wall, his eyes tracking the activity inside the server room, his composure revealing nothing of the tension within. He knew that Marcus had installed a secondary, hidden partition on the servers, a digital, dead man switch designed to trigger upon unauthorized access. Watching the lead technician reach for the final, most sensitive drive, Julian stepped forward, his hand raising in a silent, urgent gesture to halt the procedure. The technician froze, looking toward Eleanor for confirmation, who immediately signaled for a complete stop, trusting Julian's instinct over standard protocol. Julian entered the server room, the air suddenly heavy with the threat of total digital annihilation, as he prepared to neutralize the hidden trap. The heavy air in the boardroom turned thick with digital static as the forensic software initiated the first phase of deep data extraction. A sudden, sharp alarm pierced the silence. The primary screens flickered violently before going completely black, signaling the activation of Marcus's hidden sabotage script. Panic surged through the board members as progress bars on their personal devices began to rapidly decay, showing the file deletion in real time. Marcus sat in his chair, a cruel, triumphant smirk forming on his lips, believing his final digital executioner had successfully erased his financial tracks. Julian did not show a flicker of surprise. His hands were already moving across the console, his movements fluid and devoid of hesitation. He bypassed the corrupted master directory, rerouting the data stream through a secure, isolated sandbox he had prepared during his months in the basement. On the main screen, the aggressive deletion code met Julian's digital barrier, stalling against the firewall with a series of frantic, failing digital pulses. Eleanor stood behind him, her sharp gaze tracking the conflict on the screen, witnessing the brutal war being fought in the invisible realm of binary. With a final, decisive keystroke, Julian forced the deletion protocol to invert, locking the malicious script within its own virtual cage. The screens instantly flooded back with high-definition financial records, the red warnings turning into cold, static, unchangeable facts that sealed Marcus's fate. The server room was finally quiet, the digital threat neutralized and the physical drives securely locked within federal evidence containers. Julian stepped back from the console, wiping his brow, his expression once again transitioning into that of an ordinary maintenance worker. Eleanor walked back into the boardroom, the tension in the room reaching a boiling point as the board members turned to face her. She held the decrypted financial report like a weapon, its pages stark white against her dark gray business suit. Marcus sat motionless, his phone vibrating incessantly on the table, every ring an echo of his crumbling influence. A senior executive slowly reached out and muted the phone, ending Marcus's last hope of external manipulation. Eleanor began to read the findings aloud, her voice steady and precise, detailing each breach of trust and every misappropriated dollar. Marcus stared at his hands, his knuckles white, as the room seemed to shrink around him with each passing detail of his downfall. Outside the boardroom, the federal agents stood guard, their presence serving as an inescapable reminder of the legal consequences awaiting the disgraced executive. With the truth finally laid bare, Eleanor finished her report, and the silence that followed was not just the absence of sound, but the final verdict on Marcus's career. The lobby of Sterling Tower was a scene of clinical precision as federal agents escorted Marcus through the polished marble hall, his head bowed in total defeat. Hundreds of employees paused in the silence, their eyes tracking the disgraced executive as he was led past the corporate security turnstiles one last time. Outside, the gray sky pressed down upon the city, the flashing blue and red emergency lights reflecting off the wet pavement of the corporate plaza. Marcus was ushered into the back of a black federal SUV, the heavy door thudding shut with a sound that signified the permanent end of his influence. High above, Eleanor watched the scene unfold from the expansive glass of her office, the cold wind rattling the windowpane behind her. Julian stepped into the office, his presence subtle and quiet, standing a respectful distance behind her as they both observed the departure of the man who had nearly destroyed them. There were no words of celebration. The weight of the reconstruction process lay before them, a mountain of broken systems and shattered trust. Eleanor turned to face Julian, her expression reflecting the grim determination required to steer the company back from the brink of total collapse. Julian nodded once, an unspoken promise that he would remain as the silent architect of the rebuilding, ensuring the safety of the foundation they had just reclaimed. As the federal vehicles pulled away into the city traffic, the shadow of the past began to fade, leaving only the hard, unvarnished reality of the future ahead. The dust of the investigation began to settle, but for Eleanor, the real work of scrubbing the corporation of Marcus's influence had only just begun. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee, a stark reminder of the chaotic morning that had just transpired. One by one, the middle managers who had facilitated Marcus's schemes were summoned and dismissed, their exits swift and devoid of any corporate ceremony. Eleanor sat at the head of the long oak table, her signature ice-blue gaze fixed on each manager as they gathered their personal effects and left the room. Down in the server room, Julian worked with a new, quiet authority, systematically purging the dead man's switches from every corner of the digital infrastructure. He felt the familiar weight of the console beneath his fingertips, the code responding to his touch with a fluid, loyal precision it had lacked for years. Every line of Marcus's sabotage code was identified, deleted, and overwritten with the robust, fault-tolerant logic he had authored in a previous, uncompromised life. Outside the server room, the corridor was empty, save for a single security guard who kept a respectful, distant watch over the silent, hard-working architect. Eleanor entered the server room, her heels clicking softly against the concrete, stopping behind Julian to watch the screen turn a steady, healthy green. They shared a moment of profound, wordless understanding, the two of them standing together at the heart of the tower, ready to guide the company toward a future of integrity. The air inside the boardroom grew dense with the finality of the audit, the board members shifting their focus from Marcus toward Eleanor with newfound respect. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, her presence steady and absolute, as she formally moved to strip Marcus of all executive authority and legal representation. Marcus remained frozen in his chair, his hands locked tightly on the arms of the leather seat as if he were trying to anchor himself to a sinking ship. A heavy silence hung over the table when the chairman called for the final vote, a collective consensus that had been building since the moment the truth was revealed. Every hand around the table rose in a silent, grim affirmation of the motion, sealing Marcus's fate within the company walls forever. The realization of total exclusion finally broke Marcus's defiance, his shoulders slumped forward, and the rigid tension in his face finally collapsed into hollow despair. Eleanor turned toward the boardroom doors, signaling for the federal agents waiting in the hallway to complete the final stage of their operation. The door opened, and the lead agent stepped inside, his presence a stark, cold reminder that the time for corporate resolution had ended and the era of legal accountability had begun. Marcus stood up one last time, his legs unsteady, looking around the room as if expecting a miracle that would never come to pass. With a steady, practiced movement, an agent placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, guiding him toward the threshold of the room and out of the Sterling Empire. The board's unanimous vote resonated through the boardroom, effectively finalizing the legal and professional exile of Marcus Sterling from the empire he helped build. Marcus sat frozen, his gaze fixed on the mahogany table as the reality of his total displacement from the company hit with the force of a physical blow. Eleanor signaled the federal agents, who moved with practiced efficiency to escort the disgraced executive from the premises without further delay. The boardroom doors swung open, and the silence in the hallway was heavy, reflecting the gravity of the unprecedented corporate restructuring taking place inside. Marcus rose to his feet with a heavy, stumbling motion, his influence vanishing as he walked toward the exit, ignoring the cold stares of the board members. Julian watched from the shadows of the console, his work as the silent architect nearing its final, crucial stage of digital normalization. As Marcus disappeared into the hallway, Eleanor remained standing at the head of the table, her eyes clear and unburdened by the recent chaos. She addressed the remaining directors, declaring that the era of hidden agendas was over and that the company's future would be built on absolute digital transparency. The executives nodded in quiet compliance, recognizing the new, uncompromising reality that Eleanor and her silent partner had successfully established. The boardroom began to clear, leaving only Eleanor and the faint, rhythmic hum of the restored servers echoing from the room's integrated systems. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the verdict, finally codifying the end of the Marcus Sterling era and the accountability he could no longer escape. Eleanor stood at the back of the courtroom, her expression unreadable, watching as her uncle was led away, this time, not by corporate security, but by the state. Back at the tower, the atmosphere had shifted, the corridors felt brighter, and the staff moved with the confidence of people who were no longer walking on eggshells. Eleanor officially announced the new board structure, cementing the digital transparency protocols that Julian had tirelessly restored from the basement server room. Julian, having finished his final diagnostic, packed his remaining tools into his old red metal box, his face showing a rare, genuine sense of quiet accomplishment. He walked out of the tower through the main lobby, not as the invisible mechanic, but as a man who had reclaimed his legacy without ever needing the title. That evening, the suburban house was filled with the soft, warm light of a late sunset filtering through the trees. Julian sat on the porch, watching his son, Leo, play with a new, complex electronic kit, the boy's mind clearly reflecting the same architectural brilliance as his father's. The Sterling Tower was now a beacon of stability, and the shadow that had haunted its foundation for years had finally been purged by truth and light. As the stars appeared over the quiet suburbs, Julian closed his eyes, finally at peace, knowing the family legacy was safe and the future remained, for the first time, theirs to write.